Tēnā koutou katoa. Whakatakata hou ki te uru, whakatakata hou ki te tonga. Kia makina kina ki uta, ki mataratara ki tai. E hiaki ana ki atakura, he tio, he hoka, he hauhunga, tihe moriora. Tēnā koutou everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us for this panel discussion today. Thank you to our panelists, thank you to those of you in the room, and welcome to the people joining us online. Hopefully there are some people at the other end of the ether there as well. And thank you also to Victoria University for agreeing to co-host this session. Ko Grant Blackwell toka inoa. I'm the Chief Scientist for He Rangi, the Climate Change Commission, and I will be your host for this session today. It's a lovely day up there, so I'm glad you could tear yourselves away from another beautiful, sunny, brilliant Wellington day. It's always like this to join us. But before we go any further, I've been told I must give you a safety video if I can make this thing work. I've broken it already. Our frequent flyers have seen this many times, I'm sure. Drop down. Ah, there we go. It was there.
Kia ora, and welcome to Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. In the unlikely event of an emergency, we want to make sure you know what to do. Take a moment now to look around at where the nearest exit is to you. If the fire alarm sounds continuously, evacuate the building using the nearest exit. Act quickly. If you are able, drop to the ground, get under cover and hold until the shaking stops. If there is no cover, put your arms over your head and neck to protect them. Stay inside and gather in one place until it is safe to exit. If your building is unsafe, evacuate. Take your belongings, beware of falling debris, and make your way to a large open space. Follow the guidance of your host. Thank you for watching. Your safety is very important to us. We hope you enjoy the event.
Hope you do enjoy the event. Oh my God, now how do I get out of there? Here we go. Brilliant. So again, welcome. So the goal of the event today is to provide an opportunity for staff and students of the university, and the public more broadly to understand a little bit more about the Climate Change Commission, about our role and where we fit into the system. And for those of you who don't know about the Climate Change Commission, we're an independent advisory body that provides advice to the government, and we sit within the broader climate policy framework of Aotearoa New Zealand. So we provide regular, independent, expert-based advice to the government, both on mitigation and adaptation, and we provide a monitoring role where we monitor government progress as we go around trying to meet our national climate goals. So today we'll be hearing a range of perspectives on a very important question, which is this question here. How do we achieve a low emissions and resilient future? Or put another way, what's needed to shift the way we live, work and play to be more climate resilient? So we have 5 Victoria University academics here on our panel today, 2 of whom are representing the Commission in their role as Commissioners, Professor James Renwick and Dr. Judy Lawrence. And joining James and Judy, we have Dr. Amanda Thomas, who's a Senior Lecturer from the School of Geography, Environment and Earth Sciences, Professor Catherine Iorns from the Faculty of Law, and Professor Bargh from Te Kawa a Māori, the School of Māori Studies. So our format today is basically, I'm not going to say anything much more. We'll pass to our panelists who'll give a briefish, 5-odd 05, not 50. So introductory comments on area of the expertise or anything they'd like to tell us about. And then we'll throw to the audience for any questions or discussion you would like to ask of the panel, which can be on the topic, on the points they raised, or about the commission itself. So it's really just a chance to have a really free ranging. There's no right or wrong answers. There's probably some very wrong answers, but hopefully there's no climate deniers in the room. We don't have to go there. We have games if we do, so it's okay. And we will also be taking questions online. So for people that are joining us online, type your questions into the chat, and we have some of our team here that can make sure those questions are read out. So James, I'll pass to you for some opening comments.
Okay, that's working. And kia ora koutou, ko James Renwick tōku ingoa. Thanks everyone for coming along. It's great to have this session. We've been talking about it for a while. It's brilliant that it's happening. So this question of how we achieve a low emissions and resilient future, the few things I wanted to say to start with are, well, what do we need to do to get to that future, and how quickly do we need to do them? And you know, to stop at a sort of manageable level of climate change, an adaptable level of climate change. I'm thinking right now we've got these extreme heat waves happening in Europe and the US and elsewhere, fires burning across Canada. In this country, we've had devastating flooding from ex-tropical cyclone Gabrielle and atmospheric rivers. I'm wondering whether we're already past a point of adaptability in some respects in some parts of the world. So it's obvious to me we need to stop making this problem worse as soon as we possibly can. So we need to stop emitting greenhouse gases ASAP. The latest IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said for us to have a coin toss 50% chance of stopping warming at 1.5 degrees, we need to see global emissions starting to come down within the next year, basically, before the end of 2024. And we need to get to zero emissions no later than 2050. If we don't achieve those things, well, it'll get warmer and the extremes will become more extreme and so on. So we have to wonder about at what point are we really able to be resilient, or you know, when we go beyond that. So in my mind, and you know, the science is telling us that we've run out of time. Basically, we have to take action right now, and it has to be pretty drastic action. We need to reduce emissions globally by 8 or 9% per year from here on. So there's no time to lose. And just thinking sort of more broadly about, well, what does a genuinely resilient, sustainable future look like? We have to do a lot, I would say, partly in relation to climate change, but also in relation to a whole lot of other environmental issues. You know, we need to stop growth, all kinds of growth. That's economic growth, growth in the use of resources, population growth. Hey, look, less is more. What a great book. Read that book, the degrowth movement, which is I don't know that I like that expression, degrowth movement, but it's about rethinking the way economics and economic activity works so that we're not just constantly having to grow GDP all the time. We need new thinking around all of these kind of issues for sure, you know, because on a finite planet, nothing can grow indefinitely. All right, and just to finish off, what kind of extremes can we avoid if we take action, and what can't we avoid? Well, I think one of the things we can't avoid is sea level rise. It's happening now. It's locked in for centuries, whatever we do with emissions. But we can slow down the rate of sea level rise and make it more manageable in that sense. Same story with the melting of ice and glaciers and the ice sheets. We can control how fast that happens, but I don't think we can stop it for a long time. But I think the good news is we know if we can stop emitting greenhouse gases, we can stop global warming. You know, we could stop the rise in temperature within a year or so of getting to zero emissions. So we have all the power in that sense. We just need to get on and do it right now, starting today, please. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
Pass to Judy. Some comments from you, Judy.
Yeah, kia ora tātou. Yes, we have to reduce emissions, but we're joined at the hip with adaptation. And the Commission has a mandate to monitor the system and to monitor progress and the effectiveness of adaptation. And adaptation is fast reaching limits. So we have to be aware that as the world is changing around us, we have to be cognizant of the adaptation actions we take so that they don't lock us in the future and we can't get out of them. So we're addicted to protection type options in this country and all over the world is. And we have to change that and anticipate change. So adaptation and mitigation are entirely interdependent of each other. The more the emissions come, the smaller the space for adaptation, okay? And some adaptations will have limits, like seawalls for sea level rise, like raising houses. There's only a certain amount you can raise your house, and there's only a certain amount of sediment that you can nourish your beaches with. And of course, there are economic costs involved in those as well, which will limit us over time. So the Commission has a very important role, which is being independent. We can call the government, and we have, and we can monitor the progress that's being made across the community and within government on adaptation. And also we are monitoring our emission reductions as well. So having an organisation like the Commission is incredibly important because it's like an audit role in a sense. Okay, and that's really important in a system where there are huge barriers to acting in our own interests rather than in the interests of the community. So going forward, we have quite an important role, and it needs the support of the community who can help take some of those actions and also make their decision makers make those actions and design processes for taking those actions as well. So the most important thing that is in the jigsaw puzzle of our institutions is the Adaptation Act, which is currently being drafted, but we need it because it's going to deal with the issue of managed retreat and funding, because without money and being able to apply money to both adaptation and mitigation, but particularly adaptation, we're not going to be able to make progress in the transition to a low carbon future. I'll leave it there.
Amanda, next on the list.
Au tina tātou, e rere aku mihi ki a koutou kua rere mai nei, ko waia hau, no kōterangi, no ingarangi, no okurangi, kōterangi o kutupuna, ko Amanda Thomas tōku ingoa. So I'm Amanda, Senior Lecturer in Environmental Studies, and I'm a feminist political geographer, which means that I'm interested in how we shift the parameters of what is possible and challenge uneven power relations. So I've been thinking about this provocation, about how we achieve a low emissions and resilient future and shift the way we live, work and play to be climate resilient. So I'm really interested in thinking about what is seen to be politically palatable in this space and how we get some movement around that. Many of the dominant narratives around how we need to respond to climate change focus on market-led solutions or the role of innovation for new technologies. But I think that we all have a role, the Commission has a role, but all of us as members of the public have a role in challenging this because it is quite problematic. It's problematic because these kinds of approaches promise techno fixes, that some technology is just around the corner, that's going to make us all be okay living the way we live now, and we can continue with business as usual. So there's the promise of something better and greener just around the corner. And actually the Zero Carbon Act frustratingly sets up the Commission in many ways to take this approach, requiring them to consider anticipated technological developments in their advice. But they're also required to consider social, cultural, environmental and ecological circumstances, the distribution of benefits, costs and risks between generations, and the Crown Māori relationship, Te Ao Māori, and specific effects on iwi and Māori. So there's a balancing of things that they need to consider, but it's interesting, I think, that anticipated technological developments is one of them. So with colleagues, Dr. Aotearoa and Maria Bargh, we've been thinking about airports and aviation. So just bear with me on a wee sidetrack here for a second. Yes, segue. So actually, I noticed that the Commission is currently seeking submissions on a review of whether emissions from international aviation and shipping should be included in the 2050 target. The submissions are open till the 31st of July. So it's in my diary to submit. I encourage others to as well. Domestic emissions fall within the Paris Agreement, so net zero by 2050. Aviation plays a really essential role in who we are here in Aotearoa New Zealand. Lots about our national identity is about our concerns about how others perceive us, but also experiences like going on our OE, but also 30% of us were born overseas. So we have familial connections overseas, and aviation plays a really important role in sustaining and who we are and sustaining our connections outwards. But in some ways it means things like aviation and the airport infrastructure that goes with them have become sacred cows that we're not allowed to question in our discussion about how we deal with climate change. So for Wellington City, for example, something like 12% of our emissions come from aviation and air travel. So we have recently also seen critical attention grow around this issue, and all across Europe there's protests happening, blockades of proposed airport expansions, vandalism of private aeroplanes. But here in Aotearoa New Zealand, it's a little bit harder to get some of that discussion going. We have airports like Wellington International Airport. We have airlines like Air New Zealand promising electric planes or battery-powered hybrid systems. And these promises mean that business as usual carries on, because after all, Air New Zealand will be replacing their fleet with sustainable aircraft from 2030. We don't know with what, but that's what they've promised to do. It's estimated that less than 20% of the world's population has ever taken a flight. There's spatialities within countries as well. 1% of the population in India takes 45% of all flights. 15% of the population in the UK takes 70% of all flights. A large chunk of the global population never flies, yet we all bear the cost. A report by Paul Callister and Robert McLaughlin says, under business as usual growth in aviation, if we were to fulfil that promise of electrification in Aotearoa New Zealand, by 2050, we would be using the equivalent of Aotearoa New Zealand's current whole electricity supply just on aviation. So based on the modelling of electricity requirements in Auckland, electric or hydrogen planes would create a power demand equivalent to 6 times that produced by Manapōuri Power Station. This kind of thinking that we will have these techno fixes locks us into these kinds of infrastructure decisions that build on longer injustices. So in 2008 and 2009, going back to Auckland Airport, they were building a second runway. And as they were building it, the remains of around 90 Māori were dug up. They're about 600 years old, the remains. Tangata whenua had warned the airport that there was an urupa there. Some structures from the Aotearoa pā had already been quarried in the preceding decades, and the material used to build runways, and that will always be Māori land. But when it comes to infrastructure, we know that there's a disproportionate impact on particular populations, and Māori have borne the brunt of things like the Public Works Act that enable land to be taken for infrastructure. And that remains the case, even as that infrastructure is transferred increasingly into private hands. So we need to be thinking now about who and what we are building for and the legacies that we build. And there's particularly pressing questions that relate to and that come in times of disaster. So Raven Cretney and Sophie Bond, writing in 2014 about responses to disasters, question a resilience framing. They ask, when people talk about as resilience is bouncing back to what? Bouncing back for who to the status quo? So the provocation for the panel was what's needed to shift the way we live, work and play. And this signals to me a keenness to bounce forward to something different that shifts our lives. But who's we? Whose behaviours, habits, lives need to shift? Who needs to change? And there's big differentiation even within our borders in terms of who has choice about emissions, who profits from emissions, and who faces the worst consequences of the failures to mitigate or of maladaptation. So my critical friend challenge to the Commission is to embed notions of social and ecological justice and visions of a low emissions and resilient future as best they're able to balance out the directive to consider phantom technologies that don't yet exist, or the mysterious neoliberal promise of innovation. Many tools are already within our grasp, collectives that have created the kind of resilience that bounces us forward to something fairer and more just. How can we amplify that work rather than being captured by particularly loud voices that promise a techno fix that's just around the corner? Kia ora.
Thank you, Linda.
Kia ora tātou. No whanganui a tāra aho, Wellington born and bred, through and through. Ko Kaukau, tōku maunga. Mount Kaukau is the hill that I live under and nearby and try and visit weekly. I thank the Climate Commission for this fascinating event, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to you. Ngā mihi nui o te ata, kia koutou, ngā mihi nui kia tātou katoa. I'm here to talk about laws, and particularly the role that laws, current laws, are playing or can play in this move to a low emissions future. I've covered a lot of environmental laws over my career, and I still do a lot of them, from climate change to biodiversity, Resource Management Act, and the dealing of toxics and lots of things in between. Right? I'd like to remind people that we face not only a climate change crisis, but also a biodiversity crisis. And the biodiversity one has even fewer agreed solutions, right, and even less political will to solve them than the climate crisis. So I'm going to make probably 2 points about law more generally, and then one about the natural world. I'll identify them first in case I run out of time on any of them. Right. So the first one, we need laws. We need to use laws much more boldly than we have. One, to deal with the low emissions future, or I guess to get us towards the low emissions future, and then to deal with the consequences of what we've got. We need to set more limits, enforce them, and prohibit damaging activities. Lots of things that rules can do, we just need the will to use them. A lot more tough love, I'll call it, in this climate fight. The second one is the current laws we've got are not fit for purpose. I don't know how many people have heard Geoffrey Palmer say that in their lifetime. Probably every time you hear him speak, something is not fit for purpose. Well, our climate laws are certainly that. Nor are our decision makers, I might add, I think, but it's the laws that I'm going to focus on. The third point is that we need a much greater focus on the effects of climate and everything else we do on the natural world itself. I've called it nature first as a way to look at it. So I'll say a little bit more about those three, but at least I've identified them. In fact, probably I think I'll just say about the last two. So about the current rules not being fit for purpose. Our rules on mitigation don't go far enough. They don't meet the requirements that Jim Renwick identified, the global carbon law of halving gross emissions every decade, to a net zero 2050 for a livable future. There'll be humans around, but whether they'll be civilized if we don't do these things is another matter. Interestingly, though, our adaptation rules are even less fit for purpose, right? They have not enabled to date, and they cannot right now, enable adaptation to the increasing effects of the droughts, fires, floods, sea level rise, and large weather events. We still have issues today about how to handle those worst affected lands from Cyclone Gabrielle and the Auckland rains in January. Why have they not yet been resolved? Why are people still in limbo? Because there are no proper legal mechanisms in place to do it. Governments are trying to figure it out as they go, Mickey Mousing or MacGyvering a solution within the current rules. We don't have a clear means to retreat from identified risks in advance. And so it means governments or anyone can't force people to avoid those risks, and it means they end up suffering before government acts. And I use government because that's who everybody is expecting to fix this. right, to fix these adaptation problems. Everyone's expecting a bailout when something goes wrong, especially if, insurance is not going to cover it. So the government does propose to fix some of the major barriers. As Judy mentioned, the Climate Adaptation Act we're waiting for. It'll come out any month now, I gather. But that particular act only deals with one of them, the managed retreat and the funding for it. The other one's about where you can build, like on the coast, all those coastal developments, where you can build. They're being dealt with under the Natural and Built Environments Bill at the moment, likely to be an act. That's the same old resource consent issues that we have today. And we've still got some of those problems. We've got a grab bag of outcomes that someone has to weigh up. Right. And you weigh up climate adaptation with development, with nature, with all these other social, economic and well-being goals in there. It's not just climate. We've still got I should ask a question. Are we going to get mandatory sea level rise guidance on coastal developments, or are we going to be stuck with the voluntary advice that isn't working? Councils around the country are still approving developments in coastal hazard areas today, which I think they're doing it with insufficient protections. Right. I note from, I think it was in the news this morning, that Kāinga Ora has been lobbying Wellington councils to change its plans, right, to allow more houses to be built on flood-prone land. They spent $800,000 on just this lobbying and the advice behind it, just on that one, building more houses in Wellington in areas that are currently zoned not for housing, for good reasons for some of those zones. So we need more hard and fast and certain rules. It's like needing certainty if we're going to prevent decisions now hamstringing hazard risk reduction in years to come. I'm going to jump to the third point about the natural world. We think we've had it bad with these events, the forest fires, the floods, the droughts, the heat waves. It's the non-human species, though, that have been suffering the most. Right. And that's going to get worse. Billions of animals are reported and have been estimated to have wiped out just in last Australian's bushfires. Sorry, the Australian bushfires last summer. In this coming summer, with the onset of El Nino, and this is Kevin Trenberth's stepwise predictions, right? The summer starting December, January, February is where we projected the next step up in temperature rises, projected to smash previous temperature records. It was to smash last summer's wildfire temperature records. And there are areas already that don't have koalas, right, from last year's bushfires that used to have them. What are we going to lose this summer? What is Canada going to be losing? Closer to home, right, seabirds and marine mammal colonies already are reducing around Aotearoa, with fewer babies of all the birds, the sea lion pups, the seals, all those sorts of things. We are stealing their food and giving them plastic to eat. Right? Climate change is only making it worse for them, with having to go further to find their foods. So with all of this bigger picture, we need to put nature first, I think, at least for adaptation planning. We've got to decide where the non-human species are, what they're going to need for adaptation. Are their habitats going to move? Where are they going to need to move to before we take those spaces for ourselves? For example, where are the migratory birds going to go when sea level rise takes their sandy shores, especially if the beaches are currently bounded by private property? Think the Miranda Shorebird Centre in the Firth of Thames. It's pasture on the other side of where the beaches, and mangrove areas where it's not pasture, and currently waterways are taking down silt to grow more mangroves, taking over the beaches. So they're losing beaches from the seaside and from the land side. We arguably have a responsibility to provide for them, given the humans are the ones that have caused these problems and their predicament. Do we have to start buying up, or at least plans to earmark land for purchasing to set aside for species conservation? It's the same thing with treaty issues. There's plans in advance, well, there have been, they're not exactly brilliantly executed and not comprehensively executed. And the one thing they don't have is private land, but set aside for treaty settlements. There's arguments that we should be setting aside private land in advance when it comes up for sale. All right, I'm not setting aside, earmarking, I should say, not just for treaty settlements, but for species conservation. So whatever we need for species, we're going to have to plan for that before we plan our own managed retreat. So remember, retreat is not just going to be housing. It's where are different foods going to be grown? Where is industry going to be located? There are many heavily polluting industries right now situated on very low-lying areas, like around our ports. Think of the port of Tauranga. That's one of the best or perhaps worst examples. No potential new neighbours are going to want them in their backyard. All right, but we're going to have to either get rid of those industries or find them somewhere else to go. So we better start planning for those fairly quickly. So I do applaud the Climate Commission for its identification of the priority risks to the natural environment from climate change. And it does have reference to the importance of nature-based solutions. I could talk more about nature-based solutions and the way they've used them in their report, for example, but I do say we have to go faster and prioritise nature. And I'll leave it there by just saying we can't see them all as all of these actions we're taking as just for the benefit of humans. We ultimately need to change our relationship with the natural world, change our mindset about our place within it, stop treating nature like a slave, and we can use law to help us do that. So I'll leave it there. Kia ora tātou.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, kua hui hui mai nei I tēnei ahiahi. Ko Maria Bargh tōku ingoa, a heuri o Te Aroa me Ngāti Awa, e mihi ana kia koutou. Kia ora everybody, Maria Bargh, manawatia a Matariki, Happy New Year. Hopefully you've enjoyed the last few days, well, especially our public holiday, remembering those who've passed on, spending time with your families, and have had a chance to look to the future and plan for the year coming towards us. I think having Matariki as a public holiday should remind us how far the recognition of Mātauranga Māori and Māori people has come, and how amazing it can be when tangata whenua and tangata tiriti value each other and are in good relationship with each other and papatuanuku. So respectful and balanced relationships can help bring together our strengths, such as the long history and knowledge Māori have of the stars and the ecosystems, our Mātauranga Māori, built up over generations, which includes mechanisms to protect, such as rāhui, those temporary restrictions, which are becoming much more common in areas around the country to look after some of that biodiversity decline that's happened on the Kāwanatanga Watch, and bring that all together with Western knowledge systems and ways of approaching the environment. We can see that these things brought together can be really valuable, recognising all of our strengths. However, as we've heard, our current system has created an imbalance in these relationships to te taiao, to the environment, and between tangata whenua and tangata tiriti. So, for example, in the climate change context, central government have introduced several regimes, including the ETS, which doesn't acknowledge or reward the land that Māori have kept in bush and scrub, because developing it may have conflicted with kaitiaki values or the preservation of biodiversity and cultural practices, but they have supported, including through subsidies, areas to be felled, to felling those forests, creating potentially dairy farms, earning profits, externalising costs to the environment, and for those who are now praised for reforesting those areas that were previously chopped down. And there are just three other areas that I wanted to talk about that linked, these topics are in the latest report. So in terms of enhancing research, science, innovation and technology, Māori have tended to be locked out of this kind of regime. Mātauranga Māori has been seen as a lesser body of knowledge, and Māori communities who live close to taonga and have this intergenerational knowledge of those taonga and have been struggling to protect the biodiversity in taonga have tended to be ignored. But this whole sector should be tiriti-led. Article 2 of Te Tiriti requires Māori are empowered to develop and safeguard Māori knowledge. Some of that is about elevating the status of mātauranga to be equal with Western science, including in the solutions that we invest in for climate action. So resourcing is required to Māori-led research, science and technology, and that will no doubt look different from other forms of technology, such as those that Amanda was talking about. Some of the technology that I'm thinking of includes whāreki, which is woven mats out of harakeke, being used as they are at the moment by the Te Aroha Lakes Trust to suppress pest weeds in the Te Aroha Lakes. So those are forms of technology that use mātauranga Māori and bring them to resolve contemporary solutions that we now have in our Te Aroha Lakes. And so funding for those sorts of technologies, needs to be supportive, and others, mātauranga innovation hubs, flourishing to support flourishing low emissions worlds. Many of these suggestions have been presented already in a report called Te Pūtahitanga by Māori science scholars, and in some other parts of the Climate Commission's work, they've referenced these sorts of ideas. But those are some of the difficulties there. The importance and relevance of mātauranga Māori for understanding and addressing many of our current dilemmas is gaining wider acceptance. We can see that government agencies are demonstrating some commitment to working towards ensuring that Māori rights are protected in that area, including Te Taonga. The second area I wanted to just mention where we've still got this imbalance and some challenges is under the topic heading Accelerating Climate Finance and Funding in the Climate Commission report. And this is an area that Māori have been also shut out of many Crown provisions of funding and finance for climate activities. But Māori ourselves have been funding climate action activities and emissions reductions directly and indirectly via Māori land held in the DOC estate as carbon sinks, and lakes and rivers that have been acquired by the Crown and are being used for renewable energy generation at zero cost are also some examples. Directly, Māori are supporting and funding climate action through planting and replanting and pest control. And that's the nexus and the connection between trying to support biodiversity to flourish instead of decline, and climate mitigation and adaptation. So now the rangatiratanga sphere of authority should be funded directly to enable Māori to accelerate these sorts of biodiversity and caring and tikanga-led practices. In terms of fostering the circular economy and the bioeconomy, which is one of the third areas from the report, well, the Crown has assumed ownership of all sorts of taonga, which Māori never gave up rangatiratanga over, including lithium, for example, which is now cast as a critical strategic mineral. And Māori practices of intergenerational political economic thinking has again or often been seen as a lesser form of economics. But Māori rangatiratanga should be recognised, and those activities that Māori are already involved in, fostering economies that support intergenerational thinking, whanaungatanga, place-based and whakapapa investment models need to be considered. We know the climate crisis is bringing tougher decisions to a wider range of communities, and that makes it even more critical that we have these respectful and balanced relationships so that we can make robust and sustainable decisions together. No knowledge system or political system has all the answers. That's why I suggest that as we journey from where we are now and transitioning to the vision of a future that we're looking forward to, where we have these respectful and balanced relationships and partnerships, we should think about a tika transition. And to me, a tika transition includes both recognising and acknowledging tikanga Māori, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in all decision-making about adaptation, managed retreat, and transitional processes to the sustainable, resilient future. And we can already see examples of
other more tika relationships developing. And they may be small and they may be localised and decentralised, but they are solutions nonetheless that we can build on. And some of those include in Tamaki Makaurau, Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei have a native plant nursery. They've transformed what was a pony club into a nursery and a marakai where people of Auckland can get greens. So supporting food sovereignty and resilience, studying the best ways to regenerate and bring back the native forest in that area. Similarly, in the Waikato, the mana whenua-based group Pūniu River Care have a native plant nursery and are planting riparian areas, connected waterways to protect those precious ecosystems and simultaneously build stronger relationships with all sorts of communities. And we know we can't plant our way out of this, but those relationships and supporting connections amongst communities enables discussion about the tough decisions. In my own area, in my hapu Ngāti Kia Ngāti Tuara, we have a little micro hydro generating renewable energy to support our local energy resilience. And in Te Arawa, there are other lots of great examples, but I would also point to the marae around the country. During Cyclone Gabriel and other floods, marae have stepped up. They're often not categorised as civil defence hubs, so don't get the same funding as other sorts of hubs, but nonetheless stand up, look after those who have fled their homes and are places of refuge and safety. And I think, again, these are small, potentially localised solutions, but marae are all over the country. And if we can look to those places and support them again and fund the place of refuge and safety that they already are, then that's one of the solutions we can see. So I think we need to keep supporting some of these solutions, and some of it emerges from the Climate Change Commission's report. And I'd like to see, further consideration of this idea of a tika transition as we go forward. Tēnā koutou.
Right, thank you, Maria. Thank you, everyone. I've got pages of notes already myself, about 6 pages I scribbled down here. I'd like to have some conversations and ask some questions, but I'd like to throw it to the room. I know we have some online, but if we have, brilliant. We have some runners. We have some very funky microphones here that don't really look like microphones, but we'll bring those around. If you could speak into those just so that everyone can hear the questions, that'd be fantastic.
My question's for each of the speakers. Could you please tell us what your carbon footprint was for last year, including work and time?
I haven't calculated mine last year. I can't.
So I'm going to criticise the premise of your question. We actually know that the very idea of individualised carbon footprints is something that has come out of the fossil fuel industry as an effort to individualise responsibility with people, and effectively it makes us feel like we have no agency. Lots of us have little choice about our carbon emissions because we live in a capitalist society. Many of us do have choice, so there's importance in us thinking about what we do, but it's never enough just to think about ourselves, and the notion of a carbon footprint individualised in that way, I'm very sceptical about the political utility of that. Yeah.
The others, please, if you'd like to.
I did do a calculation last year and it came out to about 5 tonnes for me.
Thank you.
I haven't calculated mine recently, but I've stopped eating red meat for a while. And I drive an electric car and I use public transport, and I generally am alert to reducing my carbon footprint in everything I do, which includes recycling clothes, all sorts of things like that. But again, I agree with Amanda that focusing on what individuals can do when we have bleeding obvious things that we need to do across the community by in terms of reducing emissions, the big things that can actually make that difference. I was mindful as I came into town today that the what's her name, the Welsh Commission, which is like a commission for the future generations, was saying how influential they were in monitoring the government's activities around investing 2/3 of their budget into transport budget into roads, and her actions in calling a government to account reduced that to 1/3 of the transport emissions going into roads and the rest going into public transport. And I think those are the sorts of instruments that can get the big reductions that we need in our emissions.
The last speaker.
Well, Mr. General. Well, I'm alert to these things and support what Amanda said.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you all for your great presentations. I was especially pleased to hear James acknowledge degrowth as a way of going forward. But we've got the emissions trading scheme at the present time, which is a price-based system. And basically governments are not prepared to allow it to actually work in that way. I'd like to know whether any of you would support the tradable energy quotas, which David Fleming proposed over a decade ago and was considered by the UK and the European Parliament. But possibly they didn't go forward because they thought it might be result in degrowth, having a steady state economy, and they wanted more growth. But we have had rationing in times of war, and the public accepted it. And we do have a sort of situation that's approaching, a wartime situation with the biodiversity and the climate emergency. So we actually do need a rationing system, and if we could actually sell it. So is the Climate Commission willing to take a step forward and see that we need those 8% emission reductions per year, which James suggested was that we, according to the budget, a rationing system would, work according to the budget and see reductions every year.
Thanks very much, Paul. And we've talked about this a little bit in the past, and I think tradable energy quotas, they make a lot of sense to me, but I think you're right that it would be part of a package of sort of rethinking economic activity. It's of course it can happen, it has to happen, but it's at the moment it's a big ask, I guess. And I'm personally not sure how we get from where we are now to where we need to be fast enough. But I support what you're saying. That's all I can say right now.
Yeah, I think quotas are one way of doing this. ETSs are another way if they're allowed to work. And the government's just recently been told that they must allow it to work and are re-looking at it. So the questions really is what are the instruments that can actually get the greatest leverage, and to date we haven't seen that happen. So we do need to explore other options, but I don't really have a view on whether quotas are the best option or not, Paul. So.
Just to your point, and then I'll ask my question. So I understand what you're saying, and it's a relevant point of view. But if you like a big problem, one of the biggest drivers of not just climate change, but overshoot is overconsumption, and that's an individual thing as well as a societal thing. If you don't acknowledge the individual part of that, it lets us all off the hook. So that's my comment.
Do you want me to respond to that?
I'll ask. Can I? Oh yeah, no. Go.
Yeah, I will quickly respond to that. I did acknowledge that. Yeah, we need to be mindful and cognizant of this stuff exactly, and there are things that we can do, but doing things individually and not enough. It's the big, like Judy said, or I think it was you, wasn't it, Judy? There needs to be big shifts in what we do. And unless these things are connected up, we don't get the shifts. So, for example, all well and good for us all to move to drinking oat milk. But unless there's a kind of connected up network of people drinking oat milk, we just perpetuate different problems with our plastic bottles of oat milk. So aren't we better to tackle it as a community that campaigns for refillable oat milk stations everywhere? So I'm not saying don't drink oat milk. I'm saying if I only talk about how I'm a virtuous, lovely citizen who drinks oat milk, it doesn't shift the dial really. We need connected up community initiatives to actually shift the choices that people do have. For myself, there's lots of stuff that I in my household am doing. We recently bought an e-bike, which has been life-changing, but also, at 7.5 months pregnant, I can no longer ride my e-bike. The bus system is nowhere near good enough to get me from where I live with a 2.5-year-old up to here. So I don't have any choice. I drive my car now. So it's also like when we focus on individual choice, it deflects attention from the infrastructure deficits that mean that lots of people have no choice whatsoever. No matter, yes, there's overconsumption in Aotearoa New Zealand. Again, lots of people have no choice in that.
Yes,
and lots of people do have lots of choice.
Yeah, so my point was it's a both and.
And that's what I said, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
But I'm just...
when we ask about people's footprint, that is individualizing to one person. And so I'm pushing back on that.
Yeah,
yeah.
That's fine. So anyway, my real question is, so to me, there's many perspectives that we can take on this, but one that people don't really talk about is the role of power. So the power of wealthy elites, the power of intellectual elites. And if you look at who is giving to political parties and how much, and you think to yourself, what are they buying? So I'll just read you this little quote from J.K. Galbraith, the economist. He said, people of privilege will always risk their complete destruction rather than surrender any material part of their advantage. If we don't talk about that, very little is going to change.
I'd just like to comment that, yeah, I think that was part of my issue with the way decisions are made in modern democracies. And it comes from two different angles. So obviously you've got decision makers whose job depends on pleasing people, have them like them so they want to vote for them. But there's also obscuring the other people who it's like, I don't care, it's not numbers of voting, I want this influence from the side, which is largely hidden. We in Aotearoa do not do the lobbying, we do not expose, we're not very transparent. We don't have a lobbying register the way other countries do. Yeah, well, I mean, you have the diaries. No, they've rejected it the way other lobbying registers have been proposed. So we have a lot of influence. But we also have politicians pandering to short-term interests, and when we've got a long-term problem. So there's all sorts of reasons our decision-making system is not fit for purpose. Only one of those reasons is the lobbyists, and I mean for all vested interests generally. That is still a huge barrier. There's no doubt about it. And that's caused the delays we've got to now, and they're going to keep causing the delays. They say, one of the reasons, for example, just say if you take food with all of one of these issues, the future security of food, we have to make some, again, huge stepwise changes. And if we're going to keep feeding the world in the face of climate change, we managed to make huge changes in the 50s, the Green Revolution. Okay, one of them involved artificial fertilizers, which had lots of bad side effects. But the other one was to do with plant breeding, and they made those seeds and the new breeds available free of charge to the developing world. It was an aid package. Nowadays, all of that seed development is locked up in patents with large companies. It's just not happening because of these vested interests. It's the same with all of these, even the technologies. The vested interests are the ones saying, hey, let's do cloud seeding. I've got a machine for that. So yeah, if someone can make money out of it, they're trying to do it, whether it's good for the globe or not. So again, that's the mindset shift, the change in relationships, but it is part of the global capital system that wants to keep the power where it lies. And that power usually lies with money at the moment, which is slightly unfortunate.
We've heard that aviation emissions account for about 12% of Wellington's emissions, but we haven't really heard anything about land-based transport emissions, which by far are the greatest contributor, at least to Wellington's emissions. Now, Let's Get Wellington Moving has been tasked with reducing these. In fact, the greatest weighting to their reason for existing there is on data is to reduce emissions. There's a 40% weighting on that. Yet so far, all we've seen from them is a strong stick-based approach by removing parking and so on, which is good, but we haven't seen any carrot to coax people out of their cars. Now, light rail, of course, can provide a very delicious carrot and be a strong motivator for getting people out of their cars, yet they're placing it on the waterfront when we've agreed that we won't put any major infrastructure on the waterfront where it will soon be inundated. So in a nutshell, they're doing three things wrong with their greatest tool for reducing emissions, light rail. They're putting it along the waterfront, away from where the major demand exists, and a lot of people in Wellington are now realizing this, judging by recent letters to the editor that we've seen in the last few days. Secondly, their own statistics show that most of the cars coming into Wellington in the morning are coming from the north, where there is already rail. So why aren't people using it? And thirdly, they're taking it to Island Bay, hoping for projected demand when there is already strong existing demand. Now, coincidentally, Brent over here and I met with them this morning, yet again, to try and convince them of this. And I would urge the Climate Commission strongly to try and engage with them to show them what they're doing wrong. And Brent and I are more than willing to pass on the evidence that we have to help you with this. Thank you.
Hi. Wanted to ask if you are familiar with the legal concept of rights of nature and whether you think that potentially could or should play a stronger role in our environmental policies.
So I presume that was directed at me. I know a lot about rights of nature and have taught about that. I'll be the first one to say I hate the label because I don't think, because the rights plays into, it's a bit like these sort of tools within an existing system. Use the label rights and you think Western liberal individualism and it's me against the rest of the world. And of course I want to put more, we all need to exercise more responsibility, and that's that mindset shift, different relationship with the natural world that we need to adopt. And we need to put laws like that. But so apart from that caveat aside, so what goes under that heading, rights of nature, is typically things like regarding nature as an ancestor, which is a Maori or Indigenous approach. I mean, we were all, I don't want to say we're all Indigenous once, but we were all pagan once. We all, the Western, before we changed our gods and became Christian or Muslim or whatever it was, before we chose humans as our gods, we used to revere nature. We had a very different idea of what we should and should not do in relation to nature. So that's one of those things that Earth Laws wants to, I call it Earth Laws rather than rights of nature. That's one of the things that Earth Laws likes to try and shift the dial on and regard, for example, animals maybe as having rights in that sense that can be protected, and we have responsibilities to do so. There's a lot of things in there that they could change the dial on our response to climate change if we adopted them.
So, yeah, I'll just make a comment too. So tikanga Māori is the first source of law in Aotearoa, has a lot of these things built into it. And I think when we look at some of the pieces of legislation which have been from more than sort of 20 years of Māori struggling to have recognition for Te Awa Tupua and Te Urewera, for example, that comes from a tikanga Māori source of law. So I think my thinking would be if we continue to better recognise tikanga as a source of law, and we know that's happening in law schools in universities around the country, then that bodes well for some of these things.
And I'd like to follow up. I told Toko that completely, because that is the problem, that a lot of overseas people can say, oh, look, New Zealand's got the best rights of nature examples. And I'm going, they were never rights of nature examples. They were human rights to reparations for treaty grievances. It was an Indigenous rights claim, effectively, to settle the treaty grievances and get their river or forest, whatever it is, there's a mountain coming up, recognised as their ancestor. So it's not a rights of nature, it's more the right for humans to be recognised as the guardians. So that's a human right. So yeah, another reason I don't like the label, but yeah, it's definitely a Māori concept that got adopted, that the rest of the world thinks the best thing since sliced bread.
We might just go online and then we'll go to you, sir, and I know you've had your hand up for a bit, and then we might be running out of time. So we'll just see how we go. But do you need a microphone, Lara, or?
Yeah, much better on the microphone. Yeah, no, better without light. Yeah.
I've got, there's a few now. This one was started in the middle of the three aviation level. By some is often to revisit at the level. Have you seen what would it transition after those?
Oh, that's a really good question. In my 300 level paper, we do a lecture on imagination and hope. And during COVID times, we talked a lot about the things that we were learning during COVID-y stuff and how it kind of enabled us to imagine a different kind of flourishing future. So when I was re-looking at things for this year, I have to say I felt a little bit of despair at some of the things that we were thinking about and talking about at the time that seemed to have fallen away. I think Wellington Airport said that they were back up to about 95% of their pre-COVID passenger traffic. So it's a really, really tricky one, because it comes back to, I know lots of people that are seeing their family overseas for the first time in 5 years. And it's a little bit hard to begrudge that kind of thing, actually, I find. But I think we can have more. Yeah, this is where we need these really nuanced perspectives to come in. So the discussion about quotas before, if we think about frequent flyer points, people elsewhere are talking about frequent flyer taxation. So if we thought about an entitlement to fly or a quota to fly, when at the moment we're incentivized to fly. And so how could we think differently about the rules that sit around that? Reflection by the aviation industry, no. Airports, no. We only need to think about the proposed expansion of Christchurch Airport into Terrace and the millions that they've spent on buying up land there. Wellington International Airport wants to double their passenger numbers by 2040. And they have just, next month, will take possession of the southern half of the golf course in Miramar and pave that over. It'll probably be a car park for a while, but eventually it'll be used for planes to turn around. We don't have the settings in place to divert us away from these terrible decisions which lock us in and tie up land and perpetuate injustices for a privileged few to take regular holidays to Fiji or fly for business to the day to somewhere else, yada, yada, yada. So that was really depressing. But I think people are talking about it more. Like I said, there's a whole lot of activism happening in other places. The community around the airport, Guardians of the Bay, Strathmore Residents Association have been resisting the airport expansion. And this is where the power of community comes in. Any of those people working on their own would have achieved nothing, but those people working together haven't stopped the expansion, but have there's softened some edges, let's put it that way. Yeah. So just quickly, in France now there's a rule, they're bringing in rules limiting flying if you can catch another time, if it's within 2 hours of public transport, I think. So there is hopeful stuff. And Schlossberg Airport, which maybe is the busiest airport in the Netherlands, Schiphol. There's an airport in Europe that starts with S, and they are shifting towards limiting their flights actually, and there's movements amongst some airports around limiting private flying as well. At the same time as us seeing the, acceleration of private flights.
Yeah, and none of that would happen unless you had regulations and rules. And that's come from the European Commission. Okay. So all of this means that we can't move forward unless we have a framework around it, which is your point. It's about having laws and rules, but it's also something we can learn in New Zealand is that the practice of the rules has been deficient and it is not fit for purpose. When the RMA was introduced in 1991, there was a huge shift from a determinative zoning sort of approach to an enabling theory, if you like. So you could do anything you like, as long as you didn't go across these bottom lines. So what happened? The bottom lines were reinterpreted and others wanted balance. So we went through this and we've ended up where we are today, and we're now looking to a change again. And my question is, have we got the human capability and the thinking in place to enable us to implement that? Because it might be well-intentioned, but unless we have the adaptive capacity of our human planners and engineers and all the other people that make the decisions and the politicians to actually make that shift, because it's an enormous shift. It's to one of avoiding problems. It's one of anticipating problems and taking actions ahead of things actually happening, and then avoiding the sort of decision-making that gets made on the hoof after a big storm, for example. And it's never good decision-making. It's ones where lots of trade-offs are made. So we think that we have a framework within which people can have a conversation about what sort of future they want, and then we work back from that future as to how you might actually get there, would be sort of the way I would think about it. But without that thinking and without those structures in place, we're not going to make much progress, in my view.
And I just want to add another comment about something else the European Commission's done recently. Like they've made a lot of laws that our politicians don't seem to be able to do, and we're not talking about it. And one of them that has that's on the table, I think it's been passed now, it's only been on the table for a year, is their mandated reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from livestock, and they literally mean livestock. And like agriculture generally, they say livestock. There's a 40, 60, 80% reduction by 2030, 2040, 2050. So this is mandated. I know I went through this, but basically 80% reduction by 2050. But with that step down, we've just signed a free trade agreement with the EU. I would be really surprised if they didn't also require us to do that. Otherwise, we won't accept your livestock products. And yet, are farmers not thinking about that when they object to all having to reduce? Oh, we don't want to be part of the emissions trading scheme, and are they just like, you might have to be, or else you're not going to sell anything overseas. And I just think we do have our head in the sand. Part of it is rules like that, but if someone else adopts the rules, we might just be forced to comply with them.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question about the role of auditing and monitoring by the Commission. Is it restricted to the government, or can the Commission audit and monitor the policies of particular parties? I mean, we have economists who monitor political statements at the moment. Is the Commission in a position to audit and comment on the party's policies re climate change?
Yeah, perhaps I'll comment on that. The Climate Change Response Act is clear that we are to monitor the government's national adaptation plan, but it also has a broader brief in that respect. It's not just the plan. It can monitor the progress and effectiveness and the barriers that are in place for adaptation, for having implementation of adaptation, and to suggest ways of overcoming those or addressing those. Now, it's a fine line as to how that's interpreted, and it would be at the higher level rather than at specific, say, a comment of a minister, for example, which would not be the sort of level that the accountability lies at. But having said that, there is also another provision in the Act where we give advice as a commission, and if the advice is not taken by the government, then the minister has to explain why that advice, or the government has to explain why that advice. Now, that happened earlier this year or late last year, and that then was taken up as a legal case by the Lawyers for Climate Change, who recently agreed, or the High Court agreed to a settlement, agreement that had happened between the parties. And the difficult bit with that was that, you're the lawyer, but the difficult bit around that was that it would be most unusual for a High Court to order a government to do something which was a decision of the cabinet, which was the situation that was in. And so the parties actually agreed to something, and the court gave it the stamp, if you like. So that is, in a sense, a sort of the whole process that went through was a sense of accountability. So there's a provision in there. But I think the suggestion that you make about whether individuals would be called to account is probably slightly outside the role that the Commission plays.
Hello, can you hear me? Cool. My name's Hugh. I'm 20 years old. I'm currently in second year environmental studies, and I started my degree in 2021, and I got pretty freaked out about what I learned from earth science because it's all very scary, and I was 18 and didn't really know what was going on. So I dropped out and I've come back now to study. But basically my question is, one of the reasons I dropped out was because the stuff that I learned made me think that by the time I continue with my study, maybe I get a honours or a master's, and maybe I go into a job, work my way up to a position of power to somewhere where I can actually change society, whether that be in the private sector or the public sector. Oh, it's too late. We've screwed everything up, right? And so this urgency of the matter is something that is quite struggling to deal with. And I feel like now, when I look around, society is functioning the same as it was in 2021 when I first started studying and first started learning about this. And I don't know, I feel like we kind of talk all about like, oh, 1.5 degrees, we got to avoid like what's going to happen at 1.5 degrees, and which is true. I just think that we are basically, from my understanding of the subject, as kind of James very nonchalantly says, that we are kind of heading towards societal collapse within my lifetime. That's kind of what I'm thinking, and that we're undermining the very systems that are fundamental to our civilization. We're breaking through all of these planetary boundaries. We've got soil erosion, ocean acidification, climate change, biodiversity loss. Like it's so hard to even comprehend. And first of all, I don't know, I guess I kind of just wanted to ask you guys, what do you think I should do as someone who doesn't really have that much power, as someone who, well, I do, I know, but like not, you know what I mean? I'm not up there. I'm a student, and so many other students. And yeah, something that frustrates me is I'm walking around, everyone's kind of like la-di-da-di-da, thinks the world normal, and I'm like, shit, I feel like I see the entire world in a completely different way to everyone, because I look around, I'm like, everything that we do is completely temporary and probably within my lifetime is going to collapse. So I don't know, what do you say to that? Thank you.
So all of those predictions are for business as usual. Okay, all of those predictions for collapse are for business as usual. They've all been, yes, they've been modelled, and yes, they will happen if we continue business as usual. All right. If you change the trajectory, then you can avert those. okay, we've got a lot. I say, well, we've got 1.5 locked in, yes. We can, though, also still go for emissions reductions below with sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. It's not just, there's lots of other trajectories. All right, so there's one reason why it doesn't have to be paralyzing. Because you say there are things we do that change the trajectory. And the best thing, especially that students in Wellington can do, is to vote for someone who's got decent climate policies. Right? And that's coming up real soon because students are notorious for saying lots of things about things they feel strongly about, and they're not actually voting on the day. In terms of percentages, they don't. All right. Grey power gets out and votes. And they don't usually, by and large, maybe with the exception of people in this room, some of them, right? Most of them do not vote for the climate-friendly policies or the tenant-friendly policies, right? You need to get out enough numbers to go against that and elect decision makers who will take harder decisions to change trajectories. Then there's also getting really skilled. I agree with it. Get really skilled and invent some of these things that the various models are relying on.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. Okay, so I just finished, a student of mine, Lucy McLean, just recently finished her Masters of Science in Psychology, thinking about eco-anxiety, and she's now a clinical psychologist. And one of her main findings was thinking through eco-anxiety with queer theory was that one of the best things we can do when we're feeling eco-anxious is to develop a sense of agency, and we do that best with other people. So I think that the best thing that you can do is work with other people in community so it doesn't feel like you have to find an oat milk pourer alone. As a community, you can create the oat milk pouring station. But the other thing that I wanted to say, going back to the airport and the airport expansion, and I said about how Guardians of the Bay and Strathmore Park Residents Association, we've just, part of one of those groups, we've just come to the end of an extremely long process with the airport. Like I said, we've got some bits around the edges. We've also got a community fund. So if anyone is in the Eastern Ward, by the way, you can apply for up to $75,000 and $50,000 every year hereafter for projects that improve the wellbeing of community. And that came out of a mediated settlement with the airport around their expansion. But the point of me saying that was that many of us could only ever be part of that horrible, awful legal process because Gen Zero created a submission form. And with these planning processes, you have to get your foot in the door at that very first step in order to stay with any of the rest of it. And so I was only able to be part of that process because Gen Zero had worked together to create an access point. So I don't know what job you should do. I don't know what lies ahead for you, but that feeling of powerlessness and lack of agency, one of the best things that I think through my research and the research of my students, the best thing you can do about that is find your people and work with them and become friends with them as well and have a good time together. Yeah, those are the kind of the best things that we can do. And also just to say, a decade ago, nobody was talking about climate justice, no one. And so I know it feels like not enough has shifted and not enough has shifted. But in the past decade, the way we're talking and thinking about climate change, I can assure you, has shifted enormously. And so what happens in the next 10 years, I'm not sure, but there could be good things. Yeah, we may not all burn to a crisp, but I don't know.
What role does collective action play in this whole thing? But yeah, I don't know, because I'm feeling that we need to have some sort of like mass movement kind of going on, especially the government. And though I agree with you on the voting, I'm completely unconfident in our current democratic system of actually solving the problem without a wider collective action vote or something. So I don't know. Maybe, but not too late.
Do you mean like lie down on the roads?
Democracy, yeah. So democracy is not just voting. Democracy is one part of voting is one part of our democracy, but a vibrant democratic society is one where lots of people are engaged in multiple different ways. So I think it's not, I don't know that it's one big thing necessarily. I think it's many, many things coming from many, many places and many, many different communities. Like these guys here pushing around the light rail stuff, like that is essential work that people are doing together is so important. You know, Te Arawa and the things that are happening there, essential work. All these spaces where hope lives and flourishes by working together. I don't think it's one big thing. I think it's all of us in our little spaces of happiness and hope and joy, pushing for something much, much better. And there's lots of spaces like that. And Maria's done heaps of work exploring those spaces. So yeah, I don't know if you want to speak. No.
Just mindful of the time, that it's getting on to not quite bedtime, but almost tea time. So we'll go to one more question in the room here, and then we have one more online to finish up, which will hopefully finish us on a positive note. So apologies, panelists may stay for a few minutes after if you grab them for your questions if they weren't asked. I won't promise that, but we're going for you back there.
Thank you. My name is Antonietta. I want to ask you something that you were already mentioned. The 9th of July has been signed a free trade agreement with the European Union and New Zealand. And it's been sold like great news that the trade between New Zealand and Europe will be 30%, will grow of 30%. So it doesn't look like that is the policy of less is more is going very well and the government. And I would like to ask, what do you think about this trade agreement and what we should do, if it's sustainable, or materially what he creates, because all these goods, they've been traded, they come here with planes or with ships. So it's more pollution, and what we can do as a community, we should like fight against this kind of trade, be happy because they say that consumers, farmers and business, they will like have an advantage from that. So how these two kind of truth of the society go together?
Maybe I'll just make a comment on that. So two things. One, of course, those sorts of which are neoliberal trade agreements, you know, are weren't designed to protect rights of te taia or anything like that. They're designed with particular assumptions about humans at the foundational level, that humans are selfish, self-maximising individuals, and that the market mechanism, you know, is a civilising mechanism and all those sorts of things. So, you know, I think sometimes people are hoping for things from these sorts of agreements that perhaps are misplaced. That's the first thing. The second thing is one of the active opponents to those trade agreements lately has been a group called Ngā Toki Whakarururanga, co-chaired by Moana Maniapoto and Peter Tipene. And this particular group has fallen out of a mediation agreement from a tribunal case around the CPTPPA and the Māori claimants. And so, you know, Māori activists are still talking about these things, still trying to add a Te Ao Māori lens to these sorts of agreements, and keep saying they're inconsistent with, you know, the future that we want. These things are inconsistent with degrowth and all of those sorts of things. So you do have a collective saying those things. It's just something I wanted to add. I don't have the solution to the import-export aspect of your question.
All right, so focus off with one more question.
Awesome. So this one, I think, wraps well for any final comments and touches on your question also. But the news is bleak. Those of us working in climate change know this. What positive angles can we use to engage organisational leadership and the general public in urgent, critical and achievable action?
Perhaps I'll start with this one. I think the things that I tried to talk about, that there are very small and they may be localised examples, and we do need to proliferate them, but in different communities, we need to do all those things. We need to have good relationships with each other, to be able to have cups of tea with the oat milk, to be able to talk through these things. If we can't sit down and talk to each other and care for each other, how are we going to care for our environment? So we need to do those
things first. I think get together and proliferate those small scale examples. I think the best thing to say in terms of giving hope is that you could actually build a better world, right? And so one that isn't maybe, let me say, because all of these solutions that are being proposed, and I agree with all of these, is they actually are, I guess, an antidote, or they're against that neoliberal individualist model, right? Some of them are against the extreme capitalist model as well. Right. And so if you start changing those things, you might then get at the disconnection, as has been commented, the hierarchy. You might get less, what do you call the difference between the haves and the have-nots. That might become, you end up getting, if you get focused more on the well-being, you actually get a better life as well that has fewer of the nasty polluting side effects. So the idea simply is that you choose those measures with co-benefits, right? So we get a better world, not just one that hasn't got the side effects of climate change. You get all those other ones as well.
Yeah, I think the positives are that we've seen enormous networking going on around globally around these issues. And the real motivation has come from young people, Greta Thunberg and others globally, who have connected up with others like our 350 group, which started out and ended up drafting the first Climate Change Response Act. And, you know, to me, that's fantastic, because we can also link up on the science level as well with our networks around the world, and we can share what works and what doesn't work. And we've been doing that as researchers. And that brings, if you like, New Zealand's sort of lucky because we can piggyback off what works and what doesn't work down here at the bottom of the world. And others, when they know us and have these relationships with us, realise we're doing some quite innovative things. When I have constant conversations with my European colleagues about managed retreat, and they tell me to stop using the word. And I said, well, no. Because we are retreating for something. It's this war analogy that you, Paul, mentioned. And so why should we stop talking about something bold? And I think we need to be bold. And that, I think, gives me hope for my grandchildren.
And one thing I've heard from a lot of the panelists and people in the audience is just, it's about talking to each other about this issue. We're talking about it now, but you do not hear much conversation out there in the real world, as it were, about climate change. The more we talk about the issues, the more we're going to care about it, and that's greater chance we're actually going to do something, but also to cooperate with each other, to talk not just a voice in the wilderness, but to your neighbours, to your own whānau, to your workmates, whatever communities you're in. And I think, you know, just showing love for each other, that's one of the things we really need. A lot more love in the world, and just, you know, fixing climate change is a big act of love, in my opinion. Love for each other and for all the ecosystems on the planet. So, yeah, cups of tea with oat milk, absolutely. And lots of talking and generating hope, you know. Yeah, it sounds really dire, what could happen, but it doesn't have to happen. The future is not written. We have total control over what the future is going to look like. We just need to get out and get motivated. And somebody mentioned Greta Thunberg, you know, a school student from Sweden no one had heard of 6 years ago, however long ago she started all her school strike effort. And yet she's a global leader now. I'm not saying we all have to be Greta Thunbergs, but we all have a lot of power if we choose to use it. So I'd love to see, you know, more and more activism, gluing yourself to the road or spraying paint on artworks, whatever works for you, go for it.
Thank you. Well, I think cups of tea and Aotearoa is probably a pretty good place to end. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone in the room and those online that have joined. Thank you for the ideas, the contributions and the conversation. It's been great. Drive this thing one last time. If you'd like to know more about the Commission, you can find us online, climatecommission.gov.nz, just apply, or on LinkedIn. Feel free to get in touch. Love to see some submissions, have some conversations about all those things. Be fantastic. So thank you very much. I'll just close this off with our karakia and we can be on our way. Haere I roto, e te maramatanga, haere I roto, e te rangamarie, whakao wairua, kia tau, ki rangamarie, kia tātou katoa, hau, hau marie. Kia ora everyone. Thank you.